Let me guess. You're not broke. That's not the problem. You have a job, maybe even a decent one. You pay your bills. You're not underwater, but you're not free either. And somewhere in the back of your mind, at night, when everything is quiet, you feel it. This low, persistent sense that you're running in place, that no matter how hard you work, the distance between where you are and where you want to be doesn't seem to close. You read the books. You watch the videos. You told yourself this year would be different, and it wasn't. Not because you're lazy, not because you're not smart enough, but because nobody ever gave you the real rules. They gave you the edited version, the version that keeps you productive, compliant, and just hopeful enough to keep going without ever actually arriving. That feeling you have right now, that mix of ambition and frustration, that is not a personal failure. That is the predictable result of operating inside a system that was never designed to make you wealthy. It was designed to make you useful. And there is a difference, a massive one. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Here is what nobody on the internet will tell you. The people who have built real, durable generational wealth, not the influencers, not the guys renting Lamborghinis for content, the actual wealthy, the ones whose names you don't know, whose houses you've never seen, whose portfolios you will never find on social media. Those people operate by a completely different set of rules. Rules that were never published in a bestseller. Rules that were never turned into a course. Rules that were passed quietly in private between people who already understood the game. And the reason those rules stay quiet is not complicated. It's strategic. Because a rule that everyone knows stops being an advantage. What I'm going to give you today is a 40-minute deep dive into 9 of those rules. Not the surface version, not the motivational poster version, the full framework, the mechanics, the reason each rule works, and the specific ways most people violate these rules every single day without realizing it and pay for it financially for years. But before we get there, I need to break something. Because if I don't, nothing that follows is going to land the way it needs to. You have been told your entire life that visibility is power, that the way to build a career, a business, a reputation, a financial position is to be seen, post more, network more, put yourself out there, build your personal brand, be loud about your wins so people know what you're capable of. That is the advice. That is the entire thesis of modern hustle culture. And it is, at best, a half-truth. At worst, it is the mechanism by which ordinary people stay ordinary, while quietly believing they are doing everything right. The assumption underneath all of that advice is that attention converts into wealth, that if enough people see you, see your work, see your ambition, the money follows. And sometimes it does. For a small number of people, in a specific set of circumstances, visibility produces income. But for the vast majority of people who follow that model, what they get is not wealth. What they get is performance, the appearance of building without the substance of it. And there is a reason for that. Attention and capital do not operate by the same logic. Attention rewards novelty, emotion, and frequency. Capital rewards patience, discretion, and timing. These are not compatible systems, and trying to optimize for both simultaneously is one of the most expensive mistakes a person can make. the people who figured this out, and there have been people who figured this out across every century, every culture, every economic system, they all arrived at the same conclusion. Silence is not the absence of strategy. Silence is the strategy. Here is what the masses do. And I want you to watch this pattern, because I promise you, you will recognize it. Maybe in someone you know, maybe in yourself. A person gets an idea, a business idea, an investment thesis, a career pivot, a financial plan, and immediately before they've tested it, before they've built anything, before there is a single dollar attached to it, they tell people. They tell their friends. They post about it. They start building the identity around the thing before the thing exists. And in that moment, something psychological happens. The brain registers the social response, the likes, the encouragement, that's amazing, you should definitely do that. And it files that response under the same category as actual progress. The feeling of movement is produced without any actual movement occurring. And then, slowly, the motivation to actually build the thing begins to drain, because the brain already got its reward. The announcement was the achievement. The identity was the product. And the actual work, the unglamorous, unposted, unvalidated work of building something real, never happens. Or it starts and stops within weeks. This is not a discipline problem. This is not a character flaw. This is what happens when you operate inside a system that has trained you to perform progress rather than make it. Social media did not invent this pattern, but it industrialized it. It gave it infrastructure. It made performance of ambition the default mode of ambitious people. And the cost of that shift is enormous, not just in time, in actual financial outcome. Think about this for a second. The person who announces the business before it exists has already spent the most valuable asset they have in the early stage of any venture, which is obscurity. When nobody knows what you're doing, you have complete freedom to iterate, to fail privately, to change direction without social consequence. The moment you announce, you have created an audience for your process, and audiences create pressure. Pressure distorts decision-making. And distorted decision-making in the early stages of wealth building is almost always catastrophic. But here is the deeper problem. And this is the one that nobody talks about. The masses don't just perform their ambition publicly. They also perform their values publicly. They perform their financial philosophy publicly. They perform their identity as someone who is good with money or building something publicly. And in doing so, they lock themselves into positions. They become afraid to change, because change means admitting publicly that the previous position was wrong. So they stay in bad investments longer than they should. They stay in wrong careers longer than they should. They defend financial decisions that are clearly not working, because changing course would require a public acknowledgement of failure. The ego, which was supposed to be the engine of ambition, becomes the cage. The wealthy do not have this problem, not because they have no ego, but because they never gave the ego a public surface to defend. They moved quietly. They built quietly. They failed quietly. And because the failures were private, they were free to learn from them without the additional cost of social damage. They adjusted. They moved again, quietly. And they arrived at a destination that, to the outside world, looks like overnight success, lucky timing, or natural talent. It was none of those things. It was the compound interest of private, disciplined, unannounced action over a long period of time. That is the diagnosis. The system taught you to perform. The wealthy learned to build. And the gap between those two modes of operating is the gap between where you are and where you want to be. Now, 500 years ago, a man in Florence, Italy, was watching all of this play out. Not with money, with power. Because in 15th and 16th century Italy, power was money. Power was survival. Power was the difference between living in a palace and dying in a dungeon. And this man, Niccolo Machiavelli, was studying it with a precision and a honesty that nobody before him had dared to apply to the subject. Machiavelli was not a villain. That is the mythology. The reality is that he was a political scientist in an era before political science existed. He was a diplomat, a civil servant, a man who had watched governments rise and fall, who had sat in rooms with princes and popes and mercenary generals, and who had taken meticulous notes on what actually worked versus what people claimed worked. And what he found, consistently, was that the gap between the official version of how power operates and the actual mechanics of how power operates was enormous. The official version was about virtue, divine right, noble birth, public reputation. The actual mechanics were about information control, strategic patience, alliance management, and the deliberate use of silence and obscurity as offensive weapons. He wrote it all down. Most famously in The Prince, a book that was so honest about power that it was banned, burned, and added to the Catholic Church's index of forbidden books. Because honest books about how power actually works are dangerous to the people who benefit from you not understanding it. Here is what is important for our purposes today. Machiavelli was not writing about money, but every single principle he identified about the accumulation and preservation of power maps directly onto the accumulation and preservation of wealth. Because power and wealth are, at the structural level, the same thing. They are both forms of leverage over your own life and circumstances. They are both built through the same mechanisms: patience, information asymmetry, strategic relationships, and the disciplined management of what you reveal and what you conceal. And they are both destroyed by the same mistakes: impulsive action, public overexposure, emotional decision-making, and the fundamental confusion between appearing powerful and being powerful. What I am going to give you today are 9 rules extracted from Machiavelli's framework, not as abstract philosophy, but as direct operational guidance for building wealth in the modern world. These are the rules the quiet wealthy live by. These are the rules that the loud performers never learn. And by the end of this, you will understand not just what the rules are, but why they work at a mechanical level, which means you will actually be able to apply them. Before we go into the rules, I want to tell you something personal, because I think it matters for context. There was a period in my life, about 2.5 years, where I was doing everything right by the conventional standard. I was working. I was posting. I was networking. I was putting myself out there. I was telling people about what I was building. I was performing ambition at a very high level. And for 2.5 years, I got almost nothing back. Not the financial results I wanted. Not the traction I expected. Not even the sense of progress that was supposed to come from doing the work. Just the grinding, demoralizing experience of running hard and going nowhere. And I remember the specific moment when something shifted. I was talking to someone significantly further along financially than I was, and I was explaining to him, in detail, everything I was working on, every project, every plan, every strategy. I was laying it all out, probably hoping for validation, for some confirmation that I was on the right track. And he listened, quietly, for a long time. And then he said one sentence. He said, "You're spending more energy explaining what you're doing than doing it." That sentence hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for, because it was true. Not partially true. Completely, uncomfortably, undeniably true. I had built an entire architecture of communication around my ambitions. I was narrating the journey in real time, and all of that narration, all of that performance of effort was consuming the exact energy and attention that should have been going into the actual work. I stopped, not dramatically, not overnight, but I started pulling back the narration. I stopped announcing. I stopped explaining. I stopped posting about the process. I just worked, quietly, for a long time. And the results, when they came faster and with more force than anything I had produced in the previous 2.5 years of loud, visible, performed effort. That experience is the reason I take Machiavelli seriously as a framework for wealth. Because what he was describing 500 years ago, the strategic use of silence, the danger of overexposure, the power of operating in obscurity, I lived it. Not in a palace in Florence, in a regular life, with regular financial stakes. And it worked. Not because it's magic, because it's mechanics, and mechanics work regardless of the century. Rule 1. Never announce a war before you fight it. Machiavelli wrote that a prince who declares his intentions before acting has already surrendered his greatest advantage, surprise. The enemy adjusts. The terrain changes. What would have been a decisive move becomes a contested one, or a failed one. The financial translation of this principle is direct and brutal. Every time you announce a financial move before it is complete, you introduce risk that did not previously exist. You tell your colleagues you are interviewing elsewhere before you have an offer, and suddenly your current position becomes uncertain, and the new opportunity feels the pressure of your announced need. You tell your social circle you are investing in a particular asset before the position is established, and suddenly you have created a social stake in the outcome that will distort your decision-making when conditions change. You tell people you are starting a business before the business has revenue, and suddenly you are accountable to an audience for a process that requires complete freedom to iterate without judgment. The discipline here is not secrecy for its own sake. It is recognizing that the announcement itself is a cost. Every person who knows what you are trying to do is a variable that can affect the outcome. Minimize the variables. Execute first. Speak after. And if the execution fails, which it will sometimes, because that is the nature of building anything, the failure is private. You learn from it. You adjust. You try again. Without the additional weight of public failure attached to your identity, the silent mover is never trapped by a failed announcement. They simply redirect, quietly. Again, Rule 2. Your reputation is capital. Spend it like capital. Machiavelli made a distinction that most people miss. He separated reputation from image. Image is what you project. Reputation is what you have actually built through consistent action over time. And he argued, correctly, that image without reputation is not just useless, it is dangerous, because image creates expectations, and expectations that outrun reality create credibility debt. And credibility debt, in financial terms, is one of the most expensive liabilities a person can carry. Think about how this plays out practically. The person who builds a personal brand around financial success before that success is real has created a gap between their image and their reality. And maintaining that gap requires continuous effort and continuous deception, not necessarily conscious deception, but the structural deception of continuing to perform a version of yourself that does not yet fully exist. That effort is expensive. It consumes time, attention, and energy. And more importantly, it traps you. Because once the image is established, deviating from it, admitting a failure, pivoting a strategy, changing course carries a social cost that the person who never built the image in the first place does not have to pay. The wealthy, particularly the quietly wealthy, treat reputation the way a serious investor treats capital. They do not spend it frivolously. They do not leverage it beyond what the underlying reality can support. They build it slowly, through consistent private action that eventually produces undeniable public results. And when those results arrive, the reputation that attaches to them is durable because it is grounded in something real. Your reputation is a financial asset. Manage it with the same discipline you would apply to any other asset. Do not spend it in advance of what you have actually built. Rule 3. Use time as a weapon, not a burden. This is the rule that separates the patient builders from everyone else. And it is the hardest one to internalize in a culture that has optimized everything for speed. Machiavelli observed that most men are destroyed not by their enemies, but by their own impatience. They move before the moment is right. They commit to a position before the information is complete. They abandon a strategy before it has had time to produce results, because the absence of immediate results feels like failure. And in doing so, they guarantee the failure they were trying to avoid. In wealth building, impatience is not just a character flaw. It is a mathematical liability. The person who exits a compounding position early to chase something faster moving has not just missed the return on that position. They have broken the compound curve. And the compound curve, once broken, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. Because the power of compounding is not linear, it is exponential, which means the value is not distributed evenly across time, it is disproportionately concentrated at the end. The person who leaves early does not lose a proportional share. They lose access to the part of the curve where all the real value lies. But beyond the mathematics, there is a strategic dimension to time that Machiavelli understood deeply. Time changes conditions. The situation that exists today is not the situation that will exist in 6 months, or 2 years, or 5 years. The patient actor who waits for conditions to shift in their favor, who does not force the moment, who does not act out of anxiety, that actor arrives at a far more advantageous position than the impatient one who moved too early and is now trapped in the consequences of that premature action. Use time deliberately. Do not experience it as pressure. Experience it as a resource, because that is what it is. Rule 4. Let others speak. You collect. Pause for a second and think about the last important conversation you had, a meeting, a negotiation, a discussion about something that had real stakes attached to it. Think about who spoke more. Now think about who walked away with more information. These are almost always inversely correlated. The person who speaks more in a high-stakes conversation is performing managing anxiety, seeking validation, establishing dominance through volume. The person who speaks less is collecting. Every sentence the other person produces is data about their position, about their fears, about what they want and what they will accept, and what they cannot afford to lose. That data is worth more than anything you could have said. Machiavelli wrote that the prince who speaks too much reveals too much. He also wrote that the most dangerous advisor is not the one who tells you what to do. It is the one who listens until you tell them everything, and then uses that information with perfect precision. That is not manipulation. That is intelligence. And in financial contexts, negotiations, partnerships, hiring, investment decisions, it is an enormous advantage. The practice here is simple and uncomfortable because it requires overriding a very powerful social instinct. In most conversations, especially in professional or high-stakes settings, train yourself to ask one good question and then stop talking. Not one question followed by your opinion. One question, then silence. Most people are so uncomfortable with silence that they will fill it. And what they fill it with is almost always more valuable than anything you could have contributed. Rule 7. Invisibility is a position, not a liability. Here is a belief I want to challenge directly. You have probably absorbed somewhere along the way the idea that being unknown is a disadvantage. That visibility and opportunity are connected, that the more people who know who you are and what you do, the more doors open. And to a limited degree, in specific contexts, this is true. But Machiavelli identified something that runs in exactly the opposite direction. He observed that the actor who is underestimated has a freedom that the celebrated actor does not. The underestimated person can move without being watched, can fail without consequence to their reputation, can change position without triggering a reaction from people who have bet against them, can operate in spaces where the celebrated actor's presence would immediately change the dynamics. Obscurity in the early and middle stages of building something is not a disadvantage to overcome. It is an asset to protect. The person nobody is watching cannot be countered, cannot be copied before the move is complete, cannot be undermined by competition that doesn't know they exist. The stealth position is the most defensible position in the early stages of almost any financial endeavor. This does not mean permanent invisibility. Machiavelli also understood that at the right moment, when the position is established, when the result is real, when the advantage of concealment has been fully extracted, there is value in being known. But the timing of that revelation matters enormously. Too early, and you give your position away before it's secure. At the right moment, and the revelation itself becomes a form of leverage. Know when to be invisible. Know when to be seen. These are both strategic choices. Neither is a default. Rule 8. The difference between moving and performing movement. I want you to do something right now. Honest internal audit. Think about your last 5 working days. Think about the things you did, the tasks, the actions, the hours logged. Now ask yourself this question. Of those things, how many produced a measurable output that moved you toward a specific financial goal? And how many were activities that felt productive, looked productive, consumed your time and energy, but produced nothing that will matter in 6 months? I am not asking this to make you feel bad. I am asking it because Machiavelli identified this pattern in the courts and councils of Renaissance Italy, and it has not changed. He wrote about the prince who is constantly visible in his busyness, but has arranged nothing of substance, who holds meetings that produce no decisions, who is seen to be working from early morning to late night, but whose domain is actually managed by the slow accumulation of unaddressed problems. In modern financial life, this pattern has been given legitimacy by a culture that confuses activity with productivity. The inbox kept at zero, the calendar filled with calls, the late nights at the office, the long posts about the grind. These are not inherently bad, but they are also not inherently good. The question is whether they connect directly to a specific financial outcome. If they do, they are work. If they do not, they are performance of work. And performance of work, however sincere, however exhausting, produces nothing. The rule is simple. For every significant action you take in pursuit of financial goals, ask, what is the specific output of this action? And does that output move me toward a measurable goal? If you cannot answer that question clearly, the action is probably performance. Redirect the energy. Rule 9. Silence is the final and highest status signal. This is the rule that takes the longest to fully understand, not because it is complicated, but because it runs so deeply against what the culture has taught us about how status works that it requires a kind of unlearning before it can be applied. Here is the conventional model of status. You accumulate something, money, achievement, recognition, and then you signal that accumulation to the world. The car, the house, the title, the follower count, the income post, the lifestyle. The signal is the point. The signal is what converts the accumulation into social status, which is the actual thing you wanted. This model says that having something that nobody knows about is equivalent to not having it. Machiavelli would call this the model of the insecure prince. The prince who needs his subjects to constantly see and acknowledge his power, because without that acknowledgement, the power does not feel real to him. And that need, that structural dependency on external validation, is a vulnerability, because it means that the people around him control a lever. They can give or withhold the validation. They can use it as a tool. They can manipulate the prince by managing his need to be seen. The truly powerful actor, the one operating from a position of genuine security, does not have this dependency, not because they have suppressed the desire for recognition, but because they have found a deeper and more stable source of confirmation. The results themselves, the actual financial position, the compound growth that continues whether or not anyone is watching, the freedom to act without interference. These things do not require an audience to be real. They are real independent of who knows about them. And paradoxically, this is the part that takes time to land. The person who has stopped needing to perform their status radiates a quality that is immediately recognizable to anyone who is paying attention. Not because they announce it, because they don't need to. And in rooms where real decisions are being made, real money is being moved, real alliances are being formed, the person who doesn't need to perform is immediately identified as a different kind of player. Because the need to perform is so universal that its absence is extraordinary. Silence is not poverty. Silence is not failure. Silence is not invisibility in the sense of not mattering. Silence at the highest level is the signal that you have arrived at a place where you no longer need the signal. And the people who recognize that the one's worth having in your corner, they will find you. Not because you announced yourself, because your silence spoke for you. Stop here for a moment. Don't scroll. Don't skip ahead. Think about one specific area of your financial life where you have been performing instead of building. One area where the announcement came before the result, where the identity came before the substance, where you were being seen moving more than you were actually moving. You don't have to say it out loud. You don't have to post it. Just hold it clearly in your mind for a moment. Because that specific area, that gap between performance and reality, that is where the work is. That is where applying these 9 rules will produce the most immediate and concrete change. The rules I've laid out today are not theoretical. They are operational. They describe a way of moving through the world that produces different financial outcomes than the way most people move. Not because they are complicated, because they are uncomfortable, because they require giving up the social reward of being seen building, in exchange for the financial reward of actually having built something. Most people will not make that trade. The social reward is immediate. The financial reward is delayed. And humans are not naturally wired to prefer delayed rewards over immediate ones. That is not a character flaw. That is biology. But it is biology that can be overridden with clear enough understanding of the mechanics. And that is what today was about, the mechanics. Most people will watch this and move on. They will go back to the announcing, the performing, the building of identities around ambitions that never quite materialize. And some of them will be fine with that. The performance is its own reward for some people. But a few, and it is always a few, will sit with what they heard today. Will look at their financial life with a different kind of honesty. Will start making the quiet shifts, not announced, not posted, not explained to anyone, just made, privately, consistently, over time. If you are one of those few, you already know it. You felt it somewhere in this video, a specific rule that landed differently than the others, a specific pattern you recognized in yourself that you hadn't quite seen clearly before. That recognition is the beginning. Subscribe. Not because of the content you just watched, because of what comes next, the next layer, the deeper mechanics, the rules beneath the rules, the framework that the quietly wealthy live inside and that most people never even know exists. It's not loud. It never is. Decide which one you are.